whatever you think is universal, it doesn't exist, because universalization is colonization. So when you call an organization to do something in this universal way, that's what you're telling them that they have to assimilate in order to be in relationship with you. So we have to make sure that if you're trying to be in relationship with some like different cultures, the thing about diversity and inclusion, it doesn't mean just adding black faces to the same white processes and the same white practices.
Hi, this is Aisha Hauser. I'm part of the lead ministry team at the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and this is our podcast. I wanted to thank you for joining us today. I hope this inspires you, hope it builds your faith, hope it gives you perspective to experience the power of Unitarian Universalism at work. Most of all, I hope you find ways to live out our beloved faith in your life that centers liberation rooted in love. And now, The View.
In this episode, we welcome Zara, the Co-Minister of Activism, Keisha, the Co-Minister of Activism and Security Liaison, and Mimi, the Co-Minister of Art of Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro. We also welcome Janine Gelslinger, the Executive Director of UU Justice Arizona Network. Chris, what will we be discussing today on the show?
We're going to be discussing building partnerships, community organizing, and how does Blackness show up in those spaces. And for me, one of the most important things about that conversation is accountability. So if we are working in primarily heavily predominated white congregations, how are we showing up to be an accountable relationship so that we are not trying to be in spaces in ways that are harmful when we're actually trying to work to get everybody free. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Yay!
Our first question comes from podcast host Aisha Hauser.
Organizing is the art of showing up. Can you say more about what that looks like, especially when we're talking about folks who are white, of European descent, who want to help, but sometimes I have experienced some folks as taking over. They don't want to just make sandwiches or whatever it is. So folks talk about organizing being the art of showing up. Can you say a little more about what that looks like and in a best case scenario, how you feel supported?
Yeah, I can touch on that. So I think that really, the most important part of organizing initially is really just showing up. And so if you want to get involved, showing your face, especially as a white person trying to build relationships with Black and Brown communities, there's a lot of trauma there. And so it's just not gonna, we're not gonna be like, oh, look at you showed up, you can join us now, you get a cookie.
This is the voice of Zara, Co-Minister of Activism and Co-Director of Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro.
It's for the first couple times we're like, who's this white person? What are they doing? How are they holding themselves? And so that there's trust that needs to be built up, and that trust is built up by continuing to show up and be in good relationship, not taking over, being not feeling like you're above making sandwiches, not feeling like you have to basically we want to see if your white savior mentality is going to come up. So can you be in relationship with us without trying to save, without trying to run everything, without trying to tell us what to do? And once you show up enough times and we see that you're not trying to be the savior, then we're like, okay, let's see what being in relationship with you, because you've begin to show that there's accountability here. You begin to show that we can develop a relationship based off mutuality. After showing up and building those relationships, we'll begin to feel like, okay, maybe we could trust this person, maybe we can be in a relationship, right? And through that, someone who's white is someone who has access to power and privilege, and building a relationship of mutuality. They probably have access to resources that we don't have. And so at the same time, we have to make sure that, when trying to be in relationship with an institution, that the institution doesn't expect the grassroots to act like the institution. Because there's a lot of assumed norms, there's a lot of beliefs and implicit bias that people will begin believe that, oh, you know you're gonna have, like, let's say, town hall. There's maybe some beliefs about how a town hall should be held, like things should start on time. These are all Western European social constructs, and so and then you impose that on a group. So it's really important to believe, to whatever you think is universal, it doesn't exist, because universalization is colonization. So when you call an organization to do something in this universal way, that's what you're telling them, that they have to assimilate in order to be in relationship with you. So we have to make sure that if you're trying to be in relationship with some, like, different cultures, the thing about diversity and inclusion, it doesn't mean just adding black faces to the same white processes and the same white practices. Diversity and inclusion, what it should be mean, but honestly that's kind of what it means at this point, but what it should mean is that you don't cause me to assimilate so that we can be in relationship with you. It means that your institution has to learn how to break your bureaucracy to be in relationship with someone with a different culture and with grassroots.
Like, people can go for diversity and they can go for inclusion, but the second you start bringing them down to the bottom line of equity, it that's really when the shit hits the fan. Like, people just kind of start to lose their mind, about, wait a second, what are you saying? We're gonna have to shift some resources? Hold on, I thought we could just, like, be more welcoming, and people are going to be, happy to be here. So I don't also want to totally focus on the aspect of white folks coming into this work, because we do have Black and Brown and Indigenous POC UUs who want to engage with liberation.
Some of our ministries are Black only at BLM, so like it's important to also mention that, like, there are places where they're only for us, because we feel like that is necessary.
You're listening to the voice of Mimi, co-minister of art for Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro.
But I would say, like, if you want to join like BLM and do movement work, like your heart has to be in this, and like you have to have a passion to see Black people specifically liberated. It's bigger than like using words like doing anti-racist work. Like sometimes we are Black Lives Matter for a reason, so you have to be willing to fight against anti-Black violence, and that has to be something that's that you feel in the core of your soul needs to be changed, and you're willing to do what it means to put into it. And like, it's not a moment, right? These are movements. So be willing to stick it out for the long haul. And this movement is only going to be good as the people who come into it, the heart they come into it with, and the work ethic they come into it with. So all of that is really, really important. And like a lot of the times, like, people, they place really high expectations, on specific organizations, and then they come in and they realize that we're just human, right? We're not fucking superheroes. So we have to have those difficult conversations where it's like, if you want this to be some big beautiful thing, let's see what is your passion, what is your skill, what we have 5 ministries now. So like, which one of these, is it art, is it healing, is it activism, is it policy? Is it education that you want to do for community? Where do you see the places that you feel like you can really grow your liberation work in this movement, and then start to do that, and start to do it in the best way that you can. So I think just having that passion and that fire and that willingness to stick it out and actually see things through is really important. And just being able to work with a collective of folks, right? And a lot of it is about releasing individualism and leaning into like a collective and being a part of a group of other people instead of something bigger. So that's also seems to be a challenge that comes up too, when people want to just well, I want to be this main one superstar, this charismatic leader, right? It's just like our movements can't be that way. We need you to, our organization is ran non-hierarchically for the most part. So we have 4 co-directors here. So we definitely try to, we're not an executive director, so it's it's unlearning too. It's an unlearning process, being able to do movement work. And it is a very spiritual work as well. So your heart definitely has to be there in it.
Thank you for that, Mimi. I think I would also add to that is also thinking about that, in your spaces, right? Considering that the UU is the institution that it is, that does have a predominantly white base. Of thinking about that when with the Black and brown folks that are in your spaces.
This voice belongs to Keisha, co-minister of activism and security liaison to Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro.
To making sure that you're cultivating and creating safe Black only, brown only spaces for those people, because it's ingrained in us as Black and brown people to assimilate. That is what we have been taught, is to assimilate. And so it's an unconscious thing that we do. If we're in a predominantly white space, then we naturally and unconsciously sometimes will assimilate to what that space is demanding of us. And so being able to have those spaces where we can be our authentic Black or brown body and selves, then we can, that is also contributing to our liberation and contributing to us naturalizing and fulfilling our full potential as Black people.
We try and do a really good job of that in Unitarian Universalism, of the thought of that assimilation, just trying to homogenize everybody into the same, when really what we're trying to do is shift to a different way of being, right? And that homogenized version is not the goal at all. And so I see more recently, within Unitarian Universalism, the desire to be able to grow and caucus and spiritually grow as Black folks, as brown folks, as Indigenous folks in our own spaces, so that we can do that with authenticity, right, and integrity, and not do it in a way that is actually just self-perpetuating something that is already there, that we're actually trying to tear down.
Oftentimes because of that level of assimilation, right, we as Black people will perpetuate white violence through our proximity to whiteness, right? If I'm a Black woman with a white partner and I'm bringing my white partner into Black only Indigenous spaces, I am now giving my white partner permission to be in spaces where they would otherwise not have access. And oftentimes those white people may come with an enhanced level of white saviorism and or white violence in the name of, oh, I'm not racist, look at my Black partner, right? And so when we're not given opportunities to be our authentic Black selves in all Black spaces, we will often perpetuate the violence that has been perpetuated in the world on ourselves and our own personal lives unknowingly.
It's important for us in UU spaces, because this has been a recurring theme of trying to get everybody to understand about why Black spaces are sacred within Unitarian Universalism, and why it is necessary, and that we're not going to apologize for it anymore. Like this is no longer up for debate. I often refer to it as the lifeboat. We will leave you the lifeboat of information, and you can peruse it as you want. But we are moving on to doing what we need to do in order for people to get free. And I know within the Latino community, within Unitarian Universalism, that created a huge schism, about a decade ago, of really diverse ideas about what welcoming really is, and inclusion is, because we had a lot of Latino folks who wanted to bring in white partners into Black and brown spaces, and people were just saying no, and it was difficult and necessary. It was a difficult and necessary conversation, and I think that one that we have to continue to have amongst ourselves to make sure that we're doing it with integrity, but that isn't up for debate, from our white peers.
We see it so often in the movement spaces, specifically where Black and or brown people have white partners. And it's not to say that you shouldn't have a white partner, right? That is your choice and your prerogative. But it is now your responsibility to be responsible for that white partner and making sure that you're not making your Black or brown friends or comrades or whatever uncomfortable by bringing that person around without consent, right? That person doesn't automatically get access to every space you have access to just because they're your partner, and you need to be respectful and responsible of that and making sure that you're getting the consent of the people that you're around to bring that person around. Because we may not, just because they're your partner, and we may actually like them as your partner, but it doesn't mean we want them in our space all the time. And so making sure that you're responsible for that.
I wanted to also ask about the idea of coerced consent. There is this idea of I'm going to write a check to support a cause, but with that check comes strings. And that's true for all 501c3s, right? It's a way the government controls activism and any kind of social services. So would you three talk more about what you experience as coerced consent in terms of whether it's financial or otherwise? What are some of the things that you've seen and best practices to avoid that?
Thank you for that. I think it's a huge issue because I think it can happen without people realizing it. So when you have access to resources, you have access to power and privilege. And when you're working with communities who don't have access to those resources, you now have power and privilege over those communities. And so that is a power dynamic that you have to be aware of. And then you have to realize that now that we're in this position of I have power over you because I am giving you resources that you now depend on or you now, rely on. How are we dealing with this power dynamic? And so one of the ways that I think, people can think, well, I would never tell you in order for you to have this money, you have to do this, right? That's obviously coerced consent, right? But I'm not even talking about that because you can just give someone a check bigger than they had before and then ask them for a favor, and they're going to feel obligated for that favor. And so, for example, we do some solidarity work in the Navajo Nation, and we've made some rules because we are bringing food, things that people rely on. We don't take pictures. We don't even ask because they're going to feel like they have to say yes because we just gave them food. And so there's no way of, once you have that power dynamic, you have to move differently. You have to be careful of what you ask of that group because they're going to feel in debt to you. And so how do you deal with that? And so obviously making sure that the resources don't have expectations is one important way, but also just be careful what you ask, or ask before you bring the resources in, right? Because they could be saying yes out of a place of obligation, feeling like they have to do that.
I just want to affirm that as a white UU, I have to be really, really, really careful about those power dynamics, right? Fundraising is a major part of our partnership and what we do with UU Jazz. I think moving money from people who have a lot of privilege and resources into grassroots activism is a big part of what we do.
This voice belongs to Janine Gelsinger, the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Justice Network of Arizona.
And it's not... Obviously, no one's going to be like, I'm giving you this money and you have to do X, Y, Z. But like Zara said, I have to be really careful. Like, I even thought really hard, like, if I ask them to come on The View, are they going to think they have to say yes because of, what our partnership is, right? And like, would I ask them is this something they would want to do anyway because it's part of their ministry and activism? Are they doing this as a favor to me? Is that appropriate to ask? So like, I would just affirm what Zara said, but encourage what you use to like really, really think about those power dynamics, because any favor that you ask is going to have that weight behind it of any money that you've raised, any benefits that you've conferred as part of your partnership. And if you actually want to be in relationship, in partnership, you can't be exploiting your resources and your power in order to have power over someone that's not showing up as a partner.
In our UU spaces, in terms of grant making and resource allocation, right? So much of that is quote unquote outcome driven. So we will give you X resources and you will tell us the outcome of those resources after we've given them to you. And we expect you to not only predict what that outcome will be, but then report back on it if you should want more resource, right? So that kind of trifecta right there of expectation around just recently getting people away from the idea that they're going to be able to take a picture with every poor kid that they help. But even the expectation that they're going to get a report back on what these resources are doing. And that is not partnership, right? That is a coerced consent. Because even if you say, yes, I'll give you the report because I need the money, that still is a coercion of that consent. It's not, if everything else was being equal, I would be taking that time of preparing that report, right? And actually using it for us to get free. So, that is a coercion of that time. And so super important for us to reflect back to people, when we're moving these resources, particularly, that expectation needs to go away. It really does. It just needs to go away.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point, and it actually speaks to our most recent experience with the UUs. We went up to Minnesota back in, I think, the end of July. The UUs were offering a pretty big chunk of like resources and money to make this trip happen, and in that process, there was this expectation that now, because they're providing the resources, well, they should be able to document it and have someone on the ground up in Minnesota in the indigenous spaces, documenting and like on video documenting and taking pictures of the process, because we funded it, so we should be able to send our person to capture it on video. And luckily, we as BLM did not have to deal with that conversation, but I know it was put Janine in a really uncomfortable position to have to like say multiple times that, hey, we're not comfortable with this, and finally saying, like, BLM said no, this is not something that can happen, and they finally backed off. But it was a very high pressured situation of like really trying to push their way into allowing their videography crew on the ground to document what happened. And so that's one really good example of resource an expectation of exchange because of the resources that were provided.
This is fucked up. That is not being an accountable relationship, right? Like the invitation is, we have this resource of a videography team. Is there a way that could be useful to you all in this work that you're doing, right? If it is, great. If it's not, awesome. We're moving on. But to have to twist it around to be, no, this is part of, what has to happen because we're providing this other resource, and full stop it to the point of, just really having to say no, that is not partnership. That's not collaborative. That's not, Jesus Christ, how hard is it to talk about, like, what it means to be in covenantal faith with one another, and to to spiritually respect each other's needs.
One great example of collaboration partnership is just like over the summer, BLM went up with UUs twice to line 3 and the resistance fight up there. Initially, our first experience was great, and we just they funded everything, and there wasn't anything like requested of us. The second time we went up, it was different. I think Janine can speak to the particularities of the differences here, but we definitely on the back end felt the difference because we're like, okay, now now there's these things being asked of us. Now, in order for us to get funding, we have to move the date of our trip, which moved us up, which meant that we were not as prepared, which ended up causing harm. We ended up having, we ended up collaborating with a group that we didn't know, moving way too fast, not at the speed of relationships, but at the speed of money, because they were like, well, if you want this money, you have to go during this week. And we're like, well, there's no other way we can go without it. So I guess we'll do that. And then, it ended up causing harm. But the first time, there weren't those expectations put on there, and it was a much better trip. So I think that can just speak to like, to of just similar people in the same place, and uh, there's huge different results. And I think a large part it came from the expectations that were put there.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to be like really clear, speaking to other UUs, that so as a white UU myself, I've been taught that there's only one way that institutions can work, right? Like, of course you have to have a grant report at the end. Of course things have to be approved by the board. They have to be top down, right? And it really doesn't have to be that way. So what the alternative looks like is the first trip that Zara is talking about. We literally did like a ton of paperwork and fundraising on our back end and just showed up with like an envelope of cash and was like, here you go. Let me know if you need anything. Have a great trip. And like, I know that some people think like, oh, you can never do things that way. But like, yes, you can. You can do that. I think when Mimi and I started to working, I think this is a good example. When Mimi and I started working together on the Defund Coalition, there were lots of different orgs, right? And we all had different resources. And we had a conversation one day about power and how, some of us sitting in the space were like literally there with a full-time paid job to be there. And some of us were totally showing up as volunteers, and what kind of like power and equity that was creating in this space. And so we did some fundraising and pulled some resources together, and created a fellowship from UU Jazz for Mimi. And I think at first, I mean, you can speak to this, Mimi, but I think at first you were like, I don't know about this money. Like, what strings does this have? And I'm like, literally, I'm just going to send you a check every month for the next 6 months. We did no final report. We never even had I don't think we ever had a meeting. You don't have to do things that way. You really don't. And so I think it's part of what we always talk about with white folks unlearning white supremacy culture. You can imagine a different way. You've got to lean into that imagining. What kind of world are we trying to create? What does shared liberation look like? And then just start acting like it's already real. Just do things that way.
During the height of COVID last year, lockdown, we were doing similar, going out into the community with envelopes of money and handing it out to people. And the donor's fear was always that somebody would get too much, somebody would get twice, or some, and we were like, yeah, like if that's the worst thing that could happen, that somebody would have extra money to get extra food, like how bad is like the idea that somehow it's just not controlled or not exact. Just seems to be so terrifying sometimes.
I think that oftentimes that when resources are given to Black folks or people of color, there's this automatic assumption by the white entity or person giving that resource, that the Negro or the savage, right, won't know what to do with those resources unless they're given guidance by the white person giving that resource. There's this assumption that we need hand holding, and that we're children who have no idea how to produce anything worthwhile without the assistance of a white person and or entity. And so with that being said, it's like that's where that fear comes from, of the need to have a grant report, or the need to have Janine mentioned that Mimi and Janine didn't even have any sort of like touch base throughout that 6 months, right? But typically there's that need to, I need to check in and see what they're doing with my money. I need to check in and see what progress they've made. Is this worth my time and my resource? Without the full trust, and there's often not the full trust of that person who is receiving the resource that they'll do good with it. And and let's just say maybe they do have used that money to buy food instead of produce what was required of them for that resource. God forbid they took care of their family, like someone else said. I'm not sure who said it, right? And so it's always that need for control. And the thing is, like, Black people don't want revenge. If we wanted revenge, things would look a lot differently, right? We're not trying to shift the power dynamic so that we can now make you our slaves. That's not what we're trying to do here. We don't want anything to do with you. Let's be real. We just want to exist and thrive and be able to create a Black Wall Street and have a Black Pride and have Black only spaces without the fear of police coming in and or other entities coming in and tearing it down because we gained too much power. We just want to exist. Give us our reparations and let us exist in peace. That's all we want. Leave us alone and give us your resources. That's all we want.
We need additional and more resources than the average organizer, because we're because of our history and how we are our communities that have been historically ravaged through by white supremacy. So it's just like, going back to Janine's example, like if you're showing up in coalition spaces, right? Like, if like you work for a $500,000 organization and you have paid staff, and then these other organizers are coming up and they're Black or they're brown and they have volunteers, like, how can you show up for them better? And and it's not, and sometimes, like, it's harder for us to voice our opinions and to say, like, this is what we want, this is what we need, this is what we deserve. And that's because that's histories of historical trauma saying that we're not good enough and we're not deserving enough. So sometimes what you just need to do is just check on your comrade and see how they're doing. If you're in coalition with them, like, hey, what do you need? Like, how has this space been treating you? Are there any kind of additional resources that you feel like you could be providing? Like, how are you holding the weight of what you just did? Like those kinds of things, because it is difficult for us to even engage sometimes, and that's how we build stronger communities. We build stronger relationships. So I think just being that first person to check on your Black, brown, and Indigenous comrades.
And this is, a time I would remind our Unitarian Universalist congregations that we've been now almost a year and a half, pretty much without using some of our biggest capital resources, our buildings, our physical plants. And I really encourage us to make a determination whether or not that is what is sustaining our churches and our congregations, or is that resource that we can give up and redistribute. Because it is clear that we can maintain our community without necessarily maintaining those structures. And so where are those resources? Where do they need to be? Who built them? Let's ask that, right? Like, who built those endowments? Who built those UU churches? Number one. And how do we get those resources back to those folks? Because I can guarantee you it was not the white dudes out there building up those churches. Check on your comrades and check on the privilege that we have in our congregations, in our endowments, in our rainy day funds, and how we need to be redistributing that wealth.
oftentimes the first touch point of relationship building is to invite grassroots into the church. Come to our church. We're different, right? Come to our church. You can see we strive on diversity and inclusion, right? And that there's a lot of trauma in church for Black, brown, and indigenous people. You know, if you think back to boarding schools, if you think back to like the white Christian heteronormative patriarchal structure that has been adopted by white Christians, but also runs rampant in the Black Christian communities, even, you know? And so for queer people, right, that churches can be triggering. And so inviting someone to, if you're trying to build relationship with this Black or brown org or even queer org, and you're saying, come to my church, come check us out, we're different, you just sound like every other person who's knocked on my door with a pamphlet that I'm now suspicious of, and I'm absolutely not going to come to your church or want to build relationship with you. And so being mindful too of how using that as your first point of connection is not going to get you the result you want oftentimes.
I might have even been not the best UU about that, because I don't think I even told you all what Unitarian Universalism was until we knew each other for a while, and y'all were like, we thought you were like a Scientology cult. Like, we didn't even know what you were. For me, like, I could talk all I wanted about what our values are and what UUs believe and what we do, but it isn't gonna matter what I say until I show that through my actions, right? I mean, like, it just isn't going to matter. So I don't even really lead with that. You know, I'm a UU. This is our values. It doesn't matter. Like, you just have to show up and live your values, and then let people make their own determinations about what kind of person you are, what Unitarian Universalism means, because they can see it instead of just hanging out your BLM flag on your church and expecting them to roll through your door.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate y'all taking the time to be here and to continue to grow this, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to the Church of the Larger Fellowship. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit clfuu.org/podcast for more information. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Thanks again for listening.